They told him to wait with the drivers. A man in a pressed tuxedo and a woman in silk had just stepped aside to let Tyrone and the stranger he had brought pass the grand entrance. Then the maitre d', a small man with a clipped tone and the club's crest on his lapel, looked from Tyrone's frayed cotton jacket to the man at his elbow and said, "I'm sorry, you'll have to wait with the drivers." The words landed like a clean slap against a quiet room. Conversations folded. A woman, Eleanor Caldwell, in an ivory shawl so carefully arranged it looked like armor, lifted her chin in a way that spelled permission for everyone nearby to look. Phones angled. Someone laughed, small and sharp. The stranger at Tyrone's side kept his eyes down. Tyrone smiled, a small, steady thing, and said nothing. If you've ever been sized up by a room before you've had a chance to say your name, stay with this one. And if you watch this to the end, you'll see why silence can be the loudest answer. So if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe and stick around. There are moments in this that people keep asking about. 3 hours earlier, the Sterling Library at Yale had smelled of old paper and coffee, and 2 students had been dividing a table between them like 2 halves of a plan. Preston had argued about Byzantine history. Tyrone had argued about housing policy. Preston's leather jacket had been new. Tyrone's coat had been a hand-me-down, the elbow mended with careful, nearly invisible stitching. They had fought over a single power outlet like children. When the heater in the dorm kicked on and made the whole hallway smell like melted plastic, Preston had laughed so hard his exam notes scattered. Tyrone had never liked loud laughter from people he expected to hate him. With Preston, it came like sunlight through a window, unexpected and warming. "You always make terrible study partners," Preston said now, looking at a photograph printed on an old phone screen, a snapshot from 1999, a very young Tyrone, clutching a battered briefcase, a grin too large for his face. "But you were right about the zoning maps." Tyrone had left Baltimore with a scholarship and a promise. His mother, Gloria, had taught him how to carry things that did not belong to him: debt, family shame, a shirt with a missing button. She had also taught him to iron his anger flat and to fold it into something useful. He learned to count pennies, then to count opportunities instead. Years later, when a startup that matched municipal contractors with ethical investors sold to a conglomerate, Tyrone bought a small house on the edge of town for his mother and used the rest to seed the Wallace Foundation. Jobs, microgrants, a partnership with nonprofits offering stable employment to men released from shelters. He kept his name out of the press, preferring hands-on checks and quiet meetings with managers at union halls. The men who came through the program called him boss sometimes, in a way that suggested affection more than hierarchy. Preston, meanwhile, had been raised in a house with oak panels and a set of rules that all fit together like a locked box. He loved Tyrone, not despite their differences, but with the stubbornness of someone who'd picked a friend in a library and refused to let the world pry them apart. When his sister Samantha called and said, "I'm getting married at the country club," he called Tyrone without thinking about the people who would be there, the lineages arranged like place cards. "Bring whoever you want," Preston had said. "Bring Marcus if you'd like. It's my sister, not my father's social calendar." Marcus, thin, gray-eyed, a man who had slept in shelters and on friends' couches after a factory closure left him adrift, was the person Tyrone had most trusted to remind him of what mattered. Marcus had arrived at the Wallace Foundation Job Training Center nearly 2 years before, smelling of the street and anger, and left with a steady payroll job at a construction contractor Tyrone's fund had supported. He kept a small backpack and wore a watch that had once belonged to his father. Tyrone had asked Marcus to come not as a stunt, but because Marcus had become family. Marcus accepted with the wary gratitude of someone unused to invitations. They drove up the coast in Preston's old Bentley, Preston insisted, and the club's gates opened like a mouth with polished teeth. The Stonington Country Club, private, manicured, capped with history, sat on a hill that looked over the green as if it were a ruler checking the slope of its kingdom. The valet took Tyrone's shabby jacket and folded it with a small automatic courtesy that meant they had assessed and placed him in a category. The valet placed his jacket on a rack by the service door. Inside, the world smelled of lilies and champagne. Waiters winded through clusters of guests. Their silver trays caught the chandelier's light and threw it back as a rain of small suns. The Caledonia String Quartet played something soft. Plates clinked. The family name, Caldwell, hung in the air like the scent of lemon polish. Tyrone adjusted his cuff. The cloth had come from a thrift without pretense. He had chosen comfort over shine deliberately. The first of the abrasions arrived like a paper cut. A bridesmaid in a sequin dress reached the escort table and frowned at Tyrone's name card as though it were an insult to the margins of fashion. "Are you sure this is the right table?" she asked. The moment was small, ridiculous. Seconds later, it was social currency. Somebody nearby said, with the kind of practiced pity people reserve for stray animals, "Where did he say he came from? Oh, I saw. Could be with the band." Phones had already found the live stream. Someone whispered, "They're checking RSVPs online." System. Another voice, nearer, said, "We don't want any," and stopped, because the club had a code of manners that pretended to be better than itself. Preston threaded through the crowd 2 steps behind Tyrone, wearing the family's old confidence and a face that had practiced contrition in private. He had told Tyrone, in case things got difficult, "If anyone gives you a hard time, I will handle it. I won't let them be cruel in front of you." Tyrone had only smiled. "Just be yourself," he said. "And if being myself means I'm standing at a crappy table, it's still my table." When they reached the terrace, Harrison Caldwell was waiting. He filled a doorway like a punctuation mark, broad and precise, the kind of man who had never had to make small talk with strangers. His tie was a declaration. His watch whispered lineage. He looked Tyrone up and down as if reading a page too faint to be legible. "Preston, old sport," Harrison said, voice layered in ownership, then turned half to Tyrone and smiled in a way that was practiced for people who were already known by the room. "Nice of you to make it." His eyes drifted to Marcus and returned with a flicker of something like calculation. "You'll forgive me if I keep the guest list tidy." The words were courteous. Their undercurrent was a line drawn in chalk. Marcus, who had spent years reading the behavior of people who could afford to turn away, kept his shoulders still. Tyrone felt it, not as anger, but as a heat under the skin, a recognition that the room had made a decision about the shape he and Marcus could take in its light. At the front of the terrace, Derek, the groom, stood by Samantha wearing a suit that had been tailored to fit the length of possibility. He saw Tyrone and walked toward him without the wall of family caution. Derek had come to work for the Wallace Foundation in an administrative role, then accepted a steady manager's job at a small firm that Tyrone's investments had helped stabilize. He had a habit of laughing as if any day of the week could be good. When he reached Tyrone, he put a hand on Marcus's shoulder, like a bridge between two people who belonged to different pasts. "Hello, boss," Derek said, and the voice cut the room like a clean wind. Silence followed, as if someone had turned down the volume on all the small, busy noises. It took the room a moment to respond to the pivot of address. Phones dimmed, then brightened with curiosity. Conversations cratered into quiet. For a sliver of time, Tyrone saw the club through a glass that refracted everything wrong. The lilies seemed suddenly too white, the green of the fairway a surface waiting to be raked. "Boss?" Eleanor Caldwell's tone was polite but edged. Her hand tightened on Samantha's sleeve. "I'm sorry, did you?" Derek laughed, a warm, disarming sound. "Tyrone and I go back," he said. "Work buddy. My fault I didn't tell you sooner." Preston's face rose like a tide. Behind him, a phone blinked open to the Forbes article someone had cued moments before for the room's idle gossip. The headline, a neutral fact in black letters, put a new color into the air. Tyrone Wallace, philanthropist and CEO, founder of Wallace Foundation. The stream of search results was instantaneous. Photos, charity names, obscure interviews. In one, a tiny video clip showed Tyrone at a ribbon cutting, slightly rumpled, talking about job training programs. Another result showed a tax filing appearing in a PDF viewer, recognized impersonal proof. Receipt: Forbes.com. Tyrone Wallace, from Baltimore Borough to Philanthropic Tech, archived 2019. Wallace Foundation, 501c3 filings, public charity registration. Wallace Foundation Annual Report. Programs, job training, transitional housing partnerships, small business microgrants. Phones multiplied interest into a small mechanical hysteria. A woman who had been whispering about centerpieces suddenly pressed her phone into Preston's hands and said, "Is this the same Tyrone? He looks different up close." The question assumed a difference that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the room's inventory of legitimacy. Harrison's face flattened into a mask of managed displeasure. "Preston," he said, the name like an accusation. "Did you know about this?" The intended indignation landed like a coin tossed at a stranger's feet. Preston swallowed. He could have lied there, turned aside, let the current take Tyrone under. Instead, he squared his shoulders and let whatever lineage he had inherit him. "Yes," he said, "he's my friend. He was the first person to help me with my thesis the year I failed my midterms. He was there when my mother had pneumonia and couldn't cover the hospital bills. He paid for me to finish school." The words were simple, small acts of memory offered like a hand. People in the room shifted as if a draft had come through. Some looked embarrassed, others looked more thirsty for gossip. Preston didn't stop. He pulled a photograph from his phone, the same one he had scrolled through in the library that afternoon, and held it up. Tyrone, young and bright, with a notebook and a folded shirt, smiling on a narrow stoop. "He taught me how to stop apologizing for being clever," Preston said. "He taught me to be honest about what I don't know." Tyrone watched Preston. His heart, which had acquiesced to humiliation so often it had grown muscular in its patience, clenched in a way that was private and clean. He had come to a wedding that was not his own, because he respected Preston's right to craft his life. He had not come to stage a teaching moment. The room, however, had turned the incidental into a lesson. Eleanor Caldwell's eyes shone with something like fear. She began, but Harrison cut her off. "We have standards," he said. The phrase was the family's talisman, an invocation that justified 1,000 quiet exclusions. "Marcus." He spoke in a voice that had known hunger as a fact and learned to name it that way. "I slept under a bridge in 14, he said, "not for spectacle, but because truth is sometimes the only tool that clears air. I washed dishes for 6 years. Tyrone found me a job. He didn't lecture me about gratitude. He gave me a check and a coach and a chance. We both did the work." The words landed. People in the room felt the air thicken into something they could no longer pretend was a pageant with only ornament. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Someone else's phone scrolled to show the Wallace Foundation's program reports, graduate rates, job placement percentages. The evidence that had been latent now had teeth. Receipt: Wallace Foundation Annual Report, Program Outcomes, Transitional Employment Initiative, Placement Success Rate 76% over 5 years. Partner organizations include green-billed contractors, payroll data on file. Harrison's face changed, not with contrition, but with calculation. His hands tightened into the small fists of a man inspecting damage. When his father's name was invoked, a lineage that had never had to ask for inclusion, his instinct was to repair with authority rather than to understand. Preston stepped forward then, the photograph in his hand like a small, defiant banner. "Tyrone taught me how to be stubborn in the right ways," he said. "He taught me how to apologize without erasing myself. He also taught me how to see people, Harrison. If you can't see Marcus as a person tonight, that's on you." The room listened because Preston had placed himself at risk in order to save someone else the embarrassment of needing rescue. People like to see the privileged pay for their mistakes with discomfort rather than with reparations. It satisfied their improbable hunger for justice that doesn't require sacrifice. But Preston meant more than discomfort. He was shifting the cost of the evening from Tyrone to the family's conscience. Eleanor, who had watched every social calculus since her wedding day, had a sinking expression. She pressed her lips together in a way that made her mouth look like a clenched coin. Her hand found Samantha's, not to reassure, but to steady a daughter who had not known that a wedding could be a public education. The live stream, the phones, the photographs, they were not neutral. They turned private humiliation into public inventory. It was, for better or worse, a lever. And when the groom, the man who had worked for Tyrone and whose life had improved because of that work, said hello so plainly that it could not be ignored, the lever tipped. Tyrone felt the room pivot away from him and toward the idea of him, a man who could be both modest and wealthy, both humble and influential. The contradiction made people uncomfortable, because it asked them to reconcile their categories. People prefer tidy boxes. Tyrone had never been tidy for anyone's convenience. In the sudden hush, someone reached for the buffet and knocked over a tray. Another guest's fork clattered. It was as if the noise of the room had been scooped away to make room for thought. Harrison's jaw set. He found the place where he could fix this with the calm of someone used to making boundaries. He would reassert hierarchy in some quieter way. "I think we can keep the reception orderly," he said. The words like dust brushed over the scene. Preston did not let the moment pass into the easy domesticity of clipped conversation. He stepped toward the assembled guests and addressed them as though he were giving a toast, not for romance, but for truth. "A photograph says what a speech can't," he said. He held up the old picture again, the young Tyrone's grin a small rebellion in its own right. "This man showed me how to be braver. He taught me that being kind isn't a concession, it's a discipline." There was a sound somewhere between applause and a cough. Derek's laugh was sudden and sharp, entirely genuine, and people leaned back from their chairs, if only to accommodate the new weather. Tyrone's mouth quirked. Someone behind him said, half-heartedly scandalized, "Is this going to end in a lecture?" Receipt: email from Harrison Caldwell to Stonington Club Board. Subject line: Membership Standards. Internal discussion. June 2022. Extracts redacted. Available on record request. The night still had its rituals. Samantha walked down an aisle that smelled like lilies. Someone adjusted a veil. The DJ cued slow music. Yet the center of gravity had shifted. The veneer of exclusion had been exposed, and in the light of that exposure, ordinary people in the room had choices: to double down, to feign ignorance, or to ask themselves if they had ever treated someone as less before knowing their name. Tyrone could have made a scene. He could have walked to the microphone and read balance sheets like a sermon. He could have demanded resignation, legal action, public apology. Gloria's voice, still with him in memory, kept him anchored. "You do not set your soul to burn for show," she would say. "You bend it into something that builds." So he stood, steady as the man on the stoop in the old photograph, and let Preston say what needed to be said. After the ceremony, on the terrace that overlooked the fairway, the light was soft and fell on everything with a forgiving hand. Tyrone and Preston stepped away from the crowd. A thunder of phone clicks and conversation floated up like whitecaps below them. Preston put a hand on Tyrone's arm, in the way of someone who'd borrow courage from another's presence. "You didn't have to come here like this," Preston said quietly. "You could have just arrived. You could have been the story online." Tyrone smiled. "I wanted to know who would see Marcus and actually see him," he said. "Not everyone deserves to be taught in public, but this one." He nodded toward the club where people were rearranging their faces to match new information. This one needed a mirror. Preston thought of his father's voice that taught him to keep the family image clean. He thought of the photograph, of the way the Sterling Library had smelled the day they met, of the time Tyrone had lent him the money for an emergency car repair without a lecture. The gesture had been small, a way of saying, "You keep your life together, I will keep my promise." Preston had never thought his loyalty would cost him socially, but loyalty is that strange coin one spends without accounting sometimes. They walked toward the service entrance where the club's stonework met shadow. Marcus lit a cigarette with hands that had known cold. He exhaled slowly and said, "You okay?" Tyrone nodded. "I am," he said. "You?" Marcus smiled, a crooked thing that had grown from years of finding reasons to be alive. "I've eaten worse," he said. His smile made them both laugh, low and honest, and it loosened something in the night. From the terrace another voice called. It was Derek, uncorking levity like a bottle. "You two stealing the after-party?" His grin was an invitation that had nothing to do with the club's rules. When they re-entered, the mood of the room had changed again. Gossip, that fragile, quicksilver thing, had turned toward action. Conversations split into factions. Those who hoped outward reconciliation would save them, those who were enjoying the spectacle, and a small, precise group who had already recognized the moral obligation to act. Among that last group was Victoria Palmer, a civil rights attorney who knew the weight of records and the forging power of evidence. She had been a friend of Derek's mother and had followed Wallace Foundation's work in passing. Her eyes caught the ledger on a table, and she started thinking in the exact, practiced way lawyers do, of precedent, of pattern, of remedy. Later, one of the ladies at Eleanor's table, a woman who polished philanthropy like a diamond, would call Tyrone a remarkable philanthropist in a voice that had the sharpness of a saw. It was both praise and a repositioning, an attempt to put Tyrone back in his box, an admirable anomaly, safely contained. That would be the pattern for much of the evening, small acknowledgments that tried to re-anchor privilege with compliments. Receipt, text message screenshot circulating among guests. Is Tyrone Wallace the Tyrone Wallace? Forbes link? Timestamped 9:42 p.m. But within that tide of recalibration, there was a quieter current. Preston, Derek, and Lisa, who had once organized a campus drive with Tyrone, huddled and spoke low. They made small plans, to write to the club's board, to request a meeting, to push the country club to examine its membership history. These were acts small in scale, but significant in intent. That night, when the music thinned and the chairs came back to neat rows, Tyrone said goodbye to Samantha. She pressed her hand to his, eyes wet with a mixture of awe and apology. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't. My father grew up here. I never—" "You weren't raised to know everything," Tyrone said. "You're allowed to learn." Preston watched them. He saw something like a future unspooling, a place where, perhaps, the club could open a gate that had long stayed shut. It was a modest hope, a green shoot in careful soil. He had not predicted justice would arrive in this neat, cinematic way. He had only hoped his presence would tilt the scales from indifference to attention. Outside, the Bentley's headlights cut across the driveway. Tyrone, Marcus, and Preston rode back toward the city in a cabin filled with the low hum of tires on pavement and the occasional burst of resigned laughter. Marcus leaned his head against the window and watched the golf course recede like an edited memory. Preston broke the silence. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "She raised a man who knows when to speak and when to let other people learn." Tyrone held that sentence like a jewel in the dark. Gloria's teachings were the scaffolding of how he lived, an architecture of restraint and generosity. He had not come to the wedding to shame anyone, but he had not come to be ashamed either. He wanted from the night what he'd always wanted from life. That people might be given reasons to be better, not merely punished for being worse. Receipt: Wallace Foundation Grant Documentation. Wallace Greenbuild Partnership Agreement. Memorandum of Understanding with Local Shelters. Payroll verification for employees placed through Transitional Employment Initiative. When they reached Preston's house, the front lights blinked like a miniature street lamp. Preston opened the door and leaned on the frame, looking older for the moment, as if the night had measured him with a different ruler. "You could have left after Derek's greeting," he said. "You didn't." Tyrone shrugged in a small, private way. "We were invited," he said. "Besides, it matters who sees who we are, sometimes more than who knows." Marcus, with his small backpack and the watch that had been fixed up by a neighbor, smiled in a way that felt like coming home. He had not sought the limelight. He'd simply been invited to witness a friend. The contrast between his life and the room that had judged him was stark. He had once believed that the world was a line, dividing people who deserved and those who did not. Tyrone helped him see it differently. Inside the house, Preston poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Tyrone. The night had left them with an aftertaste of adrenaline and a quiet need for reflection. "We made a dent tonight," Preston said, voice rough with that particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent their evening on principle. Tyrone sipped slowly and thought of the ledger and the receipts. He thought of Marcus's steady, unperforming courage. "A dent is something," he said. "We can make it into a crack." Preston's laugh was a short, grateful sound. They sat there, old friends, in a house built with decades of expectation, and planned small next steps: a meeting with the club board, a public request for transparency, a scholarship fund conversation that might involve Olivia Coldwell, the girl the Wallace Foundation had sponsored years ago, if she wanted. The idea of involving Olivia was delicate. She had been a recipient of a Wallace scholarship when she was young, and had gone on to become a law student with a steady, cautious hope, intimately aware of how debt and privilege coiled like vines around the same fence posts. Receipt: Olivia Coldwell, Wallace Foundation Scholarship recipient, Class of 2016, current enrollment in local law school, public record confirmation available. They did not celebrate that night. They did not plan revenge. They planned process, small administrative things that, if handled with care, could create doors where there had only been stone. Preston's father would likely bristle. Harrison would complain about being made to examine himself. But in the balance, they had shifted a conversation from secrecy to acknowledgement. That was how systems sometimes began to give way, through attention, by the accumulation of small facts, by the decentering of assumed truths. Later, as Tyrone walked Marcus to the subway, where streets smelled of fried foods and the city hummed like a living instrument, a passerby glanced at them and nodded in a way that acknowledged 2 men passing without comment. The small nod felt like an act of mercy. "We're good?" Marcus asked, turning his face toward Tyrone in the dim light. "You sure you didn't want to make more of it? Put names up on signs or something?" Tyrone looked out at the city lights, at the way the night held the ordinary world together with 1,000 private threads.
I want people to change their minds because they see someone they respect treat someone else with dignity, he said, not because I lit a match. Marcus considered that, and then, with the plain humor of someone who had slept with his shoes on more nights than he cared to admit, said, "Boss or no boss, you still owe me a steak after tonight." They laughed. It was small, human, and the kind of sound that patches things that are not broken, just frayed. Behind them, the club lights shrank into the night like a distant constellation. Inside, somewhere in the room that had tried to rank people by dress and name and inherited coin, guests would continue to talk. Some would forget what they had seen by tomorrow. Others would carry it like a pin in their lapel. Tyrone, Marcus, and Preston would carry it in a different way, a ledger turned into a promise for tomorrow. Across town, in her office stacked with legal pads, Victoria Palmer started a draft of a letter she might send to the club.
It would be methodical, careful, and unrelenting in its facts. She would not use harsh language. She would marshal evidence and offer pathways to reconciliation that demanded structural changes, not only apologies. Receipt: draft letter, Victoria Palmer to Stonington Country Club Board. Request for membership demographic audit. Proposed timeline for review. Offer to mediate public forum. Tyrone's world was one of receipts and quiet arrangements. He believed in small mechanics, checks sent under cover of night, a man who got a job and could finally pay the debt that had worn his hands ragged. The wedding had not changed the world overnight. It had, however, shifted some weights in a castle that had not known its own foundation might be sinking. And in the underside of that shift lay a possibility: institutional change, not because of spectacle, but because a handful of people chose to bring light to places that had always been dim. They walked on, layers of the city's noise softening around them. The night held the smell of rain and possibility. The story of one small, crowded terrace would move into phone feeds and, with fortunate pressure and deliberate action, into boardrooms. People who had spent a lifetime preserving images would find themselves asked to account for the consequences of those images. Preston looked at Tyrone then, and something like gratitude filled him. A gratitude that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the courage it took to be himself under scrutiny. "You keep teaching me how to be better," he said. Tyrone pocketed his hands and looked at the man beside him, who had taught him to count out the small kindnesses. "We keep teaching each other," he corrected. Then, in the quiet that belongs to men who have been friends through many small disasters, he added, "And sometimes the people in the room learn too." They reached the subway, where the line was a patient human snake. Marcus, with a nod that felt like permission, turned and walked down the steps into the light. Tyrone stood for a long moment, watching him go. He thought of Gloria's hands, calloused, warm, and how she had smoothed shirts without complaint. He thought of the photographs that would be taken tonight, and the way some of those images would become evidence in a small but consequential push toward change. He folded his jacket, frayed, mended, and carried it over his arm. It was his armor because it reminded him of the work left to do. He had not come to the wedding to prove anything. He had come because a friend had asked. The evening had offered something he had not expected.
The chance to see how a room could change when someone refused to accept the categories it offered. The next morning, the Internet did what it always does. It turned a private moment into shared currency. People posted the video clip of Derek's greeting with 100 different captions. Some were cruel, others celebratory.
The club's inbox filled with messages, some indignant, some curious. Harrison drafted a statement that tried to be firm yet conciliatory. Preston fielded calls from old classmates. Samantha wrote an essay in her head about what she'd learned and what she'd say to her future children. Receipt: social media analytics, clip of Derek greeting Tyrone, 1.2 M views within 12 hours. Trending topics include class, privilege, Stonington Club. Yet beyond the noise, beyond the playlist of outrage and performative empathy, there were small, measurable things shifting. Victoria's letter reached the club's board. A local newspaper, prudent and non-sensational, ran a piece about the club's history and asked, quietly, about its membership demographics. The Wallace Foundation received messages, not all flattering, and requests to speak at local forums. Tyrone watched the ripple with a steady face. He refused interviews at first because he did not want his life to be a brand for someone's conscience. He preferred the work, grant agreements, case management, quietly negotiating a first member from a diverse background into the club's tentative oval of acceptance. He liked the work because it required patience and math and a stubborn faith in small increments. Preston, shaken from the old certainties of his upbringing, began to understand that loyalty asked something of him that he had not imagined, to challenge his family with the disciplined honesty of a son who loved them enough to make them better. The price of that love was not easy. His father would be furious, Harrison would be indignant, but every time Preston thought of the Stoop photograph, he felt the rightness of the choice like a warm stone in his chest. And Marcus? Marcus went back to his job and his modest apartment and told no one how interesting the music had been when the band hit a chord that made his stomach unclench. Life for him was often a series of careful steps. The world that had judged him that night was one more place he had crossed without incident. He kept his watch and slept the way men with jobs learn to sleep, without fear of being woken by a reality that had no mercy clause. The club's board, confronted with receipts and a public appetite for accountability, announced a review. It was a measured statement, bureaucratic in tone and precise in its lack of apology. "We will examine our policies," it said, "and report findings within 90 days." To many, that sounded like progress. To some, it sounded like delay. To Preston and Victoria, it was an opening. Receipt: Stonington Club Board Statement, public release. Membership review to commence. Timeline proposed, 90 days. When Tyrone walked past the club a month later on a rainy afternoon, just passing, not visiting, he watched as a maintenance worker spread gravel along a back path. The club's green held up against the sky like a scene on pause. He thought of doors, literal and figurative, and how they opened only when someone knocked in a way that insisted on being heard. He had no illusions about how quickly institutions changed. He had patience for the slowness. He did not expect the letter he received 3 weeks after the wedding. It was short and formal, but in the way of small offices it carried weight. Olivia Caldwell had written to say she was considering joining a panel the Wallace Foundation was convening on socio-economic mobility. The letter was careful. She did not want to be used as a pawn. But it was a willingness to engage that had been planted in the tilled soil of a changed conversation. Receipt. Letter. Olivia Caldwell to Wallace Foundation. Interest in dialogue and panel participation. Conditions. Voluntary participation. Academic framing. Tyrone folded the letter and placed it inside his wallet next to an old photograph of Gloria. He thought of the chain of small things that led from a Yale library table to a club terrace to a letter signed with a young woman's name. He thought of Marcus and the way a steady job could rewrite a life. He thought of Preston, who had risked a family name to defend a friend. He had no hunger for applause. He wanted only the quiet satisfaction of a ledger that leaned toward justice. Months later, as the club's 80-year history was pried open by minutes and member lists and the idea that tradition could be interrogated in a way that allowed for correction, an announcement came. The club would accept its first black member in a century. The board's language was cautious, the action was decisive. Harrison Caldwell resigned from his leadership position, citing personal reasons. The newspaper's headline was crisp and a little gloating: "Change at Stonington." Photos of Tyrone and Preston sitting at a small community meeting circulated with captions that read, "An unexpected alliance." Receipt. Stonington Club public announcement. First black member admitted. Board Chairman Harrison Caldwell resigns. Statement on inclusivity and long-term commitment to diversification. No single event erased the things the room had been built of. A resignation is seldom justice. It's a beginning. But there was an institutional shift that followed. Diversity initiatives, outreach scholarships, a new committee including community members. Olivia Caldwell later graduated, and in her commencement speech, modest, precise, she thanked not only the scholarships that had allowed her education, but the people who had helped hold the doors open when they should have been locked. Tyrone continued his work quietly. He and Marcus took their usual walks. Preston called more often, less guarded now, more honest in the ways that friendship allows. Harrison retreated into private life, and, for the most part, into a kind of silent reassessment.
He was not a caricature. He was a man who had been forced to look at the frame that had upheld him, and who found, like many, that the frame had no moral center. In the end, it was not a single dramatic reversal that changed things. It was the accumulation of receipts, small documents, photographs, the testimony of a groom who had once been a worker at the foundation, and the insistence of people who would not let a room define the worth of another human being. One quiet afternoon, Tyrone sat in a diner with Preston and Marcus. The coffee was bitter and the pie warm. The three of them spoke about small things: a new roofing project, Olivia's bar exam schedule, an upcoming community meeting. They also spoke about the wedding, the way a room had adjusted when someone simply refused to be shamed. Tyrone tapped his watch, the old one with a $20 band he'd had repaired, and smiled. "Gloria would say you can't force charity," he said. "You can't make people kind. You can only keep showing them the door and leaving it unlocked." Preston smiled, the kind of smile that carries the weight of an inside joke and the freedom of a conscience eased. "You brought the right kind of guest to the wedding," he said. Marcus laughed and wiped his mouth with the sleeve of a jacket that had seen better winters. "I like wedding cake," he said. "You can bring me any time." They shared a laugh that was tangled and real. Outside the diner, the city moved, its cars and buses like the breath of a living thing. Inside, 3 men, different in background, bound by friendship, ate pie and planned the next small step: a meeting with the club board, a public forum, a modest scholarship that would bear Olivia's name if she agreed. It was not a final victory. It was the habit of people choosing to do better. On the wall behind them, a faded photograph of the street from the decade when Gloria had been young leaned in a small frame. It seemed to nod approval at the quiet, ongoing work of a man who had been told to wait with the drivers and chose to stay anyway. And somewhere, in the slow turning of days, the club that had once prided itself on being untouchable found itself under a different kind of light, less flattering perhaps, but more honest. The membership rolls were not a solution. They were a map of what could be repaired. Tyrone didn't want applause. He wanted doors to open and people to feel less ashamed of seeing others as equals. The story did not end with a grand flourish. It continued in meetings and letters, in policy revisions, and in the careful work of convincing a board to let a new member in. It continued in the quiet, daily work that Tyrone had always preferred, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives. On the anniversary of the wedding, Samantha sent a card to Tyrone, simple and handwritten. "Thank you for being there, and for not letting me be comfortable with what I didn't know."
It was the kind of apology that asked nothing in return, and felt like a seed planted. Tyrone folded the card and put it with his receipts. He kept them, photographs, letters, small proof that human lives could be nudged, sometimes, toward dignity. He had learned from his mother, and from years of patient work, that dignity could be defended without shouting. It could be upheld with a steady hand, a watch that had been mended, and a friend who would stand up in front of a room and say a truth. At night, when the city hummed and the stars were near enough to be names scratched on paper, Tyrone would think of doors, how they open, how they close, and how sometimes you have to stand on the threshold and wait for others to notice you are there, not to be served, but to be seen. He left a light on in his office for Marcus's night shifts. He called Preston sometimes just to hear the cadence of his old friend's voice. He invested quietly in a shelter program that offered job placement. He refused to take the credit in public. Gloria's lessons were a ledger he kept balanced, humility on one side, action on the other. The world, as always, remained imperfect. There were nights when he would see the footage of that terrace and feel the old sting, the electric hum of being judged by what you wore or who you stood beside. But in those moments, he also felt the quiet courage of people who chose to do the wrong things differently, who preferred to learn rather than to hide. And when he thought of the drivers at the club, of being told to wait with them, he no longer felt anger, only a resolve that the next time the door opened, he would make sure someone who had been overlooked had a place inside.